Good evening and welcome. I'm Jim Hayden, First Selectman, and I am pleased to speak to you tonight about the Healthy Community, Healthy Youth Report to the Community of 2013, put on by the East Granby Youth Services Bureau, which is funded by the general government budget, operating budget. And we have got some interesting information to share regarding what's going on with our children, grades 7 through 12, and I think you'll find the information helpful, interesting, and also going forward we'll need to galvanize towards what is it as a community that we would like to do to react to some of the information that we're going to hear tonight. There's a lot of good stuff that was surfaced by the survey, and there's other things that we need to work on. So without further ado in getting the program going, I'd like to introduce Sue Lashy, who is our Youth Services Coordinator, and Sue will start walking us down the evening.
Thank you, Jim. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Board of Education, and specifically Dr. Mahoney, for their support of our efforts to administer this survey in the schools, and also the staff of the middle school and the high school, particularly Karen Gogel, who coordinated and implemented the survey process. We got a very high rate of participation in this, and we would not have been able to achieve that kind of participation without the support of the schools, so we're very grateful for that. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Youth Service Board members and staff members who are here this evening, Carrie Kilbasa and Colleen Goldnick. Finally, it's my privilege to introduce our main speaker tonight, John Davio. John has over 25 years of training, consulting, and management experience in nonprofit organizations, and his focus is specifically on substance abuse, violence prevention, school safety, and child protection initiatives. He's been working with coalitions and collaborative efforts for over 15 years, and he specializes in guiding community coalitions to increase their capacity to engage in broad and inclusive prevention efforts. He is the president of the Connecticut Association of Prevention Practitioners. He is a board member of Mobilize Against Tobacco for Connecticut Health, and he is a former director of the Connecticut Coalition to Stop Underage Drinking. John has consulted with many communities in Connecticut and other states about prevention issues and youth development, and we are very pleased to have him here this evening. Thank you for joining me in welcoming him.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening, John.
I'm going to not use the podium and the microphone, which means that if you can't hear me, don't hesitate to raise your hand, speak up, however, so that we can make sure that you are hearing me. But I haven't been accused of being loud enough on several occasions, so I think we should be all set for the evening. But please don't hesitate if you're not able to hear me. The information that we've got here comes from the survey that was done, and we're going to get into that. But I thought we'd start by just kind of introducing the topic, make sure that we know what kind of information we're actually looking at. So why don't you hit the first slide, Sue. So why did we do this survey? Well, really we wanted to assess a component of health in the community, a component of health related to our young people. We really, this idea of collecting data to help us identify, well, how are we going to target the limited resources that we have? One of the things that really brought this about was the new collaboration between Granby and East Granby related to youth services, and wanting to make sure that we spend our dollars wisely. The idea of really assessing what the problems are makes a lot of sense. And so that was one of the aspects of the survey, is it really provides us some assessment data for, well, what are the problems and what are the strengths? So therefore, what do we need to work on? So this survey is a survey of this organization called the Search Institute. And I thought I'd just give you a little brief overview of the Search Institute. They have a number of surveys that they use. The Attitudes and Behavior Survey, which was used here, is one of them. They are a highly respected national organization that, and their surveys are nationally recognized for their validity and reliability. So there's a really good surveys. This is not a couple of people sitting in a back room saying, oh, maybe this question will be good, or maybe that question will be good. So these are really good instruments. And as you can see, the Search Institute, they are a nonprofit organization themselves, and their mission is to provide leadership, knowledge, and resources to advance the health of children, youth, and families. Now, specifically, this Attitudes and Behavior Survey, this survey has been used nationally, as you can see, for over 20 years. Millions of 6th through 12th graders have taken this survey around the country. So there's a great national database on these things called developmental assets, which I promise I've got a few slides to introduce what these developmental assets are to you as well. So the primary focus of the survey is on these things called the developmental assets, which again, give me two or three more slides and we'll get to them. But it also does measure drug use, violence, and some other problem behaviors. One of the things that I really like about this survey, and as Sue alluded to, I do work with a number of communities across the state. I've seen community data from a lot of different communities. Some of them use different surveys. One of the things I really like about the Search Institute's Attitudes and Behavior Survey is this measuring of developmental assets. It really helps us to provides us with some direction about where we want to go if we want to, strengthen those things that are doing well and enhance those things or fix those things that are not working so well. The Search Institute's survey, this survey, really provides us some direction for exactly how to do that. And this is just a small sampling of other communities in this state that use the Attitudes and Behavior Survey that's put out by Search Institute. As you can see, big communities, cities like Bridgeport, medium-sized cities, Stratford, lots of rural and suburban communities from all walks of the state. And again, there's a lot more, but that's as many as fit on the slide. So, what are these 40 developmental assets? Okay, so they're a set of skills, experiences, relationships, and behaviors that help enable young people to develop into successful contributing adults. It's this framework of developmental assets that was developed, again, almost 25 years ago now. And as a matter of fact, they first came out with the 30 developmental assets back in the 80s. Their continuing research identified 10 more. So we've got 40 developmental assets at this point in time. One of the things about these assets, we talk about needing to build assets. Building assets is all about relationships. If you have a relationship with a young person, you are responsible for building assets already. You've already been doing it. One of the things that this survey can help us to do is figure out maybe there's a more targeted way that as a community we can build the assets that we feel are most important to us. So I think that's one of the benefits and the values of this survey. It allows us to come together on the asset building work that we do. Okay, so the Search Institute's research shows that the more of these 40 developmental assets that kids have, the stronger they are, the better, healthier decisions that they make. Through the data that we're going to look at, I'm going to demonstrate that fact to you on an East Granby level. So you're going to see that come to life as we go through some of the data of the survey. One of the concerns across the United States is that most people have fewer than half of the 40 developmental assets. You're doing a little bit better than the national average here in East Granby. You'll see that in a little bit too. Decades of research have demonstrated that the assets promote academic success, divert youth from these risky behaviors or these problem behaviors, increase civic engagement, and give the young people the strength they need to make positive choices in life. Kids do better the more assets they have. And again, we're going to see that on a very local level in a few minutes. So this survey was administered in December of 2012. Results came in last winter. The administration of the survey is all three of these things: voluntary, confidential, and anonymous. What that means is that any student or their parent could have opted their kid out of taking the survey, so it wasn't mandatory that they take the survey. It was confidential in that if I was one of those kids taking the survey, nobody knew what answers, it was done privately so that nobody knows, unless I want to share what my answers are, nobody knows what answers I get. And anonymous, there's no way to track that piece of paper that I filled out back to me. So there's no identifying marks or anything like that on the surveys themselves. So they're completely anonymous. No way to track results back. And the Search Institute only reports aggregate data anyway. They don't provide any information back on individual surveys or anything like that. We get grade level data and that kind of stuff. So completely anonymous. And 367 7th through 12th graders, which is about 85 to 90% of your, of course some kids are out with illness or on a field trip that day or that kind of stuff. But still, when you've got almost 90% of your kids taking the survey, obviously your sample size is fabulous. Okay, at this point, that's my little introduction stuff that I wanted to make sure everybody gets a handle on. Feel free to ask questions as we go through this. And if you have any questions on anything I've said already, this would be a good time before we jump into this stuff. But really, the more that this is an interactive presentation, the more you'll get out of it. So I encourage you to ask questions as we move through this. I'm happy to answer any questions that I can. And I don't know everything, so if I can't answer your questions, we'll figure out how to get you the answers you need. Okay, so here's a sampling of assets, right? There are 40, so of course we're not picking all of them down here. In the handout in the back of the room, they do list all 40 assets and the percentage of kids who reported those assets. Probably just a quick word about that. How do kids report these assets? There are a series of questions. The survey has 150-something, 70-something, I forget exactly, questions on the survey. And the Search Institute has their own way of putting the answers to certain questions together to determine whether kids have each of the assets. So this is their formula. This is what makes them the Search Institute. They have the formulas for the assets. So assets that were reported by a lot of our youth include the asset of family support. 75% of our youth reported having good family support. 77% reported having positive peer influence. Now, this is a good one for me to just pick apart for just a minute. This doesn't mean that the survey asked them, are your peers positive? Do your peers influence you positively? That's not how the questions is asked, of course, right? It asks questions about what do your friends do? What kind of behaviors do your friends engage in? So that then the survey, their formulas determine whether they actually have positive peer influence or not. So 77% of youth have positive peer influence. That's really high. That's really high. That's very encouraging. Achievement motivation. Over 8 out of our 10 are really motivated to achieve well in school. That's fabulous. 70% are bonded to school. They feel that their school is they feel bonded, they feel supported by their school. These again, high numbers, that's really great. Some of the kind of value assets, integrity, honesty, responsibility, again, nice high numbers there. And again, almost 8 out of 10 of our youth have a positive view of their personal future. So they're looking forward to what's coming next. Very positive things. Okay, so assets that maybe too few of our youth are reporting. Positive family communications. Only 41% of our youth report having positive family communications. Now, sometimes, the devil is in the details, and so let me tell you about this one. It's all in the definition. What is positive family communications according to the Search Institute? How do they define that? Well, they do define part of it as being able to have a conversation, positive conversations with your parents. But there's also part of the definition that includes and be willing to confide in your parents about issues of concerns or problems that you're having. And so often communities get lower scores here because, right, I'm a 17-year-old and I'm not talking to my mom or dad about this one, you get that kind of stuff. So that doesn't mean that, almost 60% of our youth have parents who are yelling at them all the time. It just means that they don't feel comfortable confiding in their parents about some of these important issues, problem issues. Caring school climate, 40% of East Granby youth report that. Community values youth. How valued do they feel by their community? Only 26% of youth. This one is often surprising to people. This is one that I see very low in almost in fact, in every single community that's ever done the survey that I've seen their data for. This one is often very low. Family boundaries. Only 45% of your youth report having the asset of family boundaries. How do we define family boundaries? Parents who know their kids' friends, monitor their kids' whereabouts, what they're doing, where they're doing them, who they're doing with. Hey, where are you going tonight? Those kinds of things. So less than half of our kids are reporting having that asset of family boundaries, where their parents are consistently asking them questions, paying attention to who they're with, when and where. Adult role models, positive adult role models. Only 30% of our youth report having positive adult role models, which means 70% of our youth are reporting that some of the adults that they come into regular contact with are doing things that maybe aren't as positive from a role modeling perspective. Creative activities, very low. Restraint, which is defined as it's important to me not to use drugs or be sexually active. So less than half of our East Granby youth report the asset of restraint. 35% report having the asset of planning and decision making. So the ability to plan ahead, make decisions about future things. And then cultural competence. 44% reported the asset of cultural competence. So again, less than half of our youth. Yes?
Is the actual survey available, the questions that they asked?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Online somewhere, or do you guys have it here to hand out? I would love to see some of these questions, how they were, and how the kids could have interpreted them.
The full report of the survey is online. It's on the town website,
Okay,
on the Youth Service Bureau page.
okay.
So,
And if you go to Appendix C or D, or it's one of the appendixes, they actually list each question and the youth's response to each question. So you can actually see all the questions, and you can
Well,
see
I'm
how.
just curious how the kids may have interpreted some of the
Yes.
questions. And if this is such a highly acclaimed survey company, I'm sure they would have had more than one question on each topic built in to catch, so there'd be less invalid answers.
Yes, and you know what? That's a good point that I didn't bring up.
How
that
your
I-
survey sometimes determines what the answers are you get.
This is a really good point that I meant to bring up that I forgot to, so thank you for reminding me. Obviously, the Search Institute goes through a data cleaning process when we first receive the surveys in. They go through a data cleaning process. Less than 1% of the surveys were discarded during that cleaning process, and they have a number of reasons that they do discard surveys. And so a very, very, very small number of the surveys were discarded in that cleaning process. So,
Is that for our town or in general?
no, for your town. The average, according to the Search Institute, is between 5 and 8% of surveys are discarded in that cleaning process. Less than 1% of East Granby surveys were discarded. So it was a nice small number, meaning we felt really confident about the results, about what the youth are telling us.
John, could you go back a slide, please?
Yes.
And then on community values youth, what of some of the communities that score higher on that, what are some of those things that they do or that the youth feel where they're valued? I mean, how does that manifest itself?
Yeah, one of the things that, I work with some communities that have been conducting this survey on a regular basis for 6, 7, 8 years now. And they've seen that number of community values youth climb up. And so what are some of the things they've done to see that increase in that asset? They found better or more, they've involved youth in some of the community processes. They found youth leadership roles. They've involved youth in different community initiatives or events. Put youth with other adults, like for example, in one community where the downtown businesses often, say, well, these kids are just hanging around and, that kind of stuff. They started a Halloween window painting contest where the businesses would let the kids come in and paint Halloween scenes. In fact, it's funny, it was Halloween because it's this time of the year, but it actually was Halloween. And, so they decorate their windows. They paint, scenes and stuff like that, whatever, Halloween stuff. I'm not an artist, so don't get me, ask me about that. But they would do that. So those kind of things that brought businesses and youth, business owners and youth together in very positive ways. So how do we bring adults and youth together in positive ways? Job shadowing programs where youth get to say, I might be interested in this career or that career, and I can, there's somebody in town who's willing to, bring me to his or her job and talk about that job with me a little bit, those kinds of things. So things that really get youth more involved. One of the things, and I don't want to get off too much on a tangent because I could with almost any of these things, but what are some roles that we can give to our youth that have value, that have meaning to them? Often, if you look at, societies from, centuries ago, youth were involved in sometimes, some of the survival aspects of the family, or things that they had significant roles that, if they didn't fulfill, could negatively impact their family, or those kinds of things. And so we don't have as much of that in this day and age in our society now. And I think we need to get back to that in some ways. We need to let youth know that they have valuable roles in our community besides just learning. How do they give back to us? How do they give back to the community? How do they become active members of our community? Okay, so there are these assets, and the Search Institute's Addictive Behavior Survey also measures these things called thriving indicators. So let's look at a few of these thriving indicators. So avoids doing dangerous things. They talk about dangerous kinds of activities. And so across the board, 23% of our youth reported this thriving indicator of avoiding doing dangerous things. And you can see the spread from 7th grade through 12th grade, okay? 25%, 25%, 23% for 9th graders, 26%, and then it kind of goes down a little bit. So not that big of a fluctuation, some fluctuation across, but a lot of our kids don't necessarily believe in avoiding doing dangerous things. And these aren't necessarily appropriate risk-taking kinds of things. These are things that are a little bit more edgy or concerning to some of us adults. But on the other side of things, helps others 1 or more hours per week. 83% of our youth reported helping others at least 1 hour a week, right? And again, some variation, a little bit higher in the 7th and 8th grade, but still pretty high as you get down to 11th and 12th grade, pretty high numbers. Now, one of the things that we can do is, and this is where we start looking at the power of assets. So if you look at that same number, 23% of our kids who avoid doing dangerous things, 83% of our kids who help others once more a week. Now if you look at it by these asset levels, as I said, there's 40 assets. And so what the Search Institute often does is, well, how about kids who have 0 to 10 assets? How about those who have 11 to 20, right? 21 to 30, 31 to 40. And what you find is, and this is where you get to really see the power of assets from the example of your own kids in this community. So of those who avoid doing dangerous things, only 3% of those with 0 to 10 assets are avoiding those dangerous things. 16% in the next asset category, so much higher, almost doubles again for 21 to 30 assets, and up to 44%. So you can see the difference kinds of decisions that kids in those higher asset categories are making compared to youth in the lower asset categories. And you can see it again here. Helps others 1 or more hours a week. 67% of those with 0 to 10 assets. Not a bad number, but you look all the way up to almost 100% of those with 31 to 40 assets. 87% of those with 21 to 30 assets. And sometimes you can see that the difference between the 0 to 10 asset category and the 11 to 20 asset category is so significant that while it would be nice if all of our kids could be in that 31 to 40 asset category, if we could just get them all into the 11 to 20, or from the 11 to 20 into 21 to 30, we could see big, big changes here in our community. So, next slide, please. A couple more of these thriving indicators. Delays gratification and overcomes adversity. 56% of our youth report being able to delay gratification. And again, 63% of 7th graders going down. We get a little blip up, or a nice blip up, I should say, in 11th grade, then back down to 48% of 12th graders. So less than half of our 12th graders report really being able to delay gratification. On the flip side, overcomes adversity. Almost 3/4 of our kids, of our youth, report being able to overcome adversity. Between 65% of 7th graders, and again, you can kind of see this little arc up and then this arc back down. You look at those same two with the number of assets that they have, and again, ability to delay gratification, only 20% of those with 0 to 10 assets are able to delay gratification. 71% though, with 31 to 40 assets. You get a much, much higher jump. And if you talk about overcoming adversity, I love this one personally. I love the overcoming adversity thriving indicator. But so 59%, less than 60% for those in the 0 to 10 asset category, all the way up to almost 90% in the 31 to 40 asset category. So you see that the assets really do make a difference. Youth who have these higher amount of assets are able to make some healthier, what I would say, healthier decisions. Okay, now we get to those risky behaviors. Go ahead, Sue. That's okay. Attends drinking parties. How many of our youth report attending a drinking party? 32% overall, but 0% of 7th graders, and almost 3/4 of our 12th graders. And of course, this is last school year now, right? So in last school year, in December of last school year, almost 3/4 of our 12th graders reported attending an underage drinking party. My guess is that we'd ask them that same question in May or June. We would have been into the 80th. We would have easily been into the 80th percentile of those 12th graders. Okay, used alcohol once or more in the last 30 days. 21% of your youth overall used alcohol in the last 30 days. This 30-day measurement is an important measurement because what we find is that you can ask kids, well, how many of you kids have used alcohol in the last year, right? And when you take a measurement like that, some of the youth are going to say, well, yeah, about 8 months ago I tried it. I had a couple of beers, I hated it, I didn't like what it did to me, whatever, and that's the last time I've ever used it. So when you go to a longer, you get youth who are not really regular users, maybe used at a family gathering or a family event, even with their parents' permission or something like that. But when you talk about last 30-day use, what you get is you get those what we call current users of a substance. So that's why this measure is important. So again, 5% of 7th graders all the way up to 45%, almost half of our 12th graders report using alcohol once or more in the last 30 days. This is a good time for me to mention that, and I want to echo Sue's acknowledgement and thank you of the schools for allowing us to do the survey. And so this is a way to measure, right? But obviously, I'm saying 12th graders, I'm saying 9th graders, because the Search Institute doesn't report these numbers by ages. But obviously, this has nothing to do with school, because what we know is that almost none of these kids are using in school. Sometimes they'll come to the basketball game, and on a few rare occasions they'll come to school drunk in the morning or something like that. I mean, it's not like that never happens, but for the most part, we're talking about these are kids who are using on Friday nights, on Saturday nights, at parties, again, if there's a basketball on a Wednesday night, maybe they're showing up drunk at the basketball game, those kinds of things. So this is not school related, even though I'm talking about grades, 12th graders versus 7th graders or whatever. It's important for me to mention that. Got drunk once or more in the last 2 weeks, right? So how many kids report being drunk? Very few 7th graders, 8th graders, and even 9th graders. Actually, I was surprised at how low the numbers were amongst your 10th and 11th graders. But that jump between 11th and 12th grade last year was whoo-hoo, almost a third of your 12th graders. And now again, look at it from the number of assets. 21% who used alcohol once or more in the last 30 days, 62% of those reporting 0 to 10 assets, down to just 4% of 31 to 40 assets, and 15% of those with 21 to 30 assets. Look at the jump between 0 to 10 assets and 11 to 20 assets. It's huge. It's a huge jump. If all of our kids were in 11 to 20 assets, we'd see rates of alcohol use going down in our community. Got drunk once or more in the last 2 weeks. Again, from almost a quarter of those with 0 to 10 assets down to absolutely none. None of the kids with 31 to 40 assets. And you'll see in a chart later that most of the kids, most of our youth fall into either that 11 to 20 asset category or 21 to 30 asset category. Like any bell curve, that's where most of the youth are. But we have these outliers. And these outliers are real concern, the outliers for the 0 to 10 assets, and their use of alcohol or other drugs is a real concern, because we know that kids youth who use alcohol and start having a problem with alcohol during their teen years are 4 or 5 times more likely to develop an alcohol problem in their life than those who wait until the legal age, for example, to start drinking. Much, much less chance of them having any problems with the substance. They haven't had a problem with it by the time they're 20 or 21 years old. Go ahead. And I really wanted to include a couple of slides because a lot of people say, okay, probably not the people in this room, right? But a lot of people say, so what's the big deal, right? Kids have a few drinks here and there, right? Maybe I did it when I was a kid. What's the big deal? Well, you know what? Actually, there is a big deal. What we have now is scientific evidence and research on alcohol that we didn't have 15 or 20 years ago. We have it now, and so we should be paying attention to what we know. And so here's something that we know, problems with alcohol, right? Researchers discovered that alcohol drastically suppressed some of our neural activity, specifically in this part of the brain called the hippocampus, right? It's crucial for learning and memory. What they found is that as you learn things, right, and you store them in this part of your brain called the hippocampus, right, there is these brain synapses, we've heard of brain synapses before, right, that help you go back and retrieve that memory so that I can say, oh, 2 plus 2 equals, I'm going to exaggerate, but that kind of thing. What alcohol does is it suppresses the ability, it suppresses what's happening with that synapse. So instead of being strengthened, when we start recalling it, it doesn't strengthen, it actually gets weaker. It makes it harder for us to then recall that memory, that learning. I don't remember it anymore, right? I got to really fish around in my brain to try to find it. It doesn't recall to me. Go to the next one. What we've also found is that our brain's white matter, and we used to think that this is that white covering. We used to think it was kind of like this protective covering. But we found out, what we know now is that it's actually nerve tissue. that helps to connect and different parts of the brain, enhances communication between different sections of our brain. What some researchers found is that those kids who were binge drinking, right, having 3 or 4 drinks in a sitting, right, at a time, in a time period, a couple few hours, through these, again, imaging technology, found that they had these, what they're calling dings in their white matter, okay? And what it was doing was, it was causing a problem in the ability of the white matter to continue that communication processes between different parts of the brain. What was really surprising about this was that these weren't these kids who were necessarily, binge drinking a couple times a week or at least every, once or twice a weekend or something like that. Sometimes these kids were only binge drinking once or twice a month, and they saw these problems in their brain's white matter. And so what we're finding is that the use of alcohol is creating problems in the adolescent brain. This is especially critical because what we know now also is that the second most active period of brain development happens in adolescence. And so obviously that first period is between ages 0 and 5, but the second most active brain development period in our entire lives is that adolescent period. So if we're screwing up our brains during our adolescence, we're causing these problems to our brain function during adolescence. In some cases, there has been concern about whether this brain damage may be permanent or not. It looks like, and again, I'm not a neuroscientist, so this is not a definitive opinion. It looks like it can repair itself over time. Sometimes, depending on how severe the damage, could be decades. Could be decades for it to repair itself. And again, some researchers would take issue with me saying that yes, I think it's repairable. So again, I'm not a neuroscientist. So okay, a couple more statistical areas for you. Drinking and driving. How many of our kids are drinking and driving? Drove after drinking once or more in the last 12 months, in the last year? Only 3%. Okay, and as you would guess, not in the 7th or 8th grade, because I have a driver's license yet. You did have a few 9th graders who reported that, a few 11th graders, but really over 10% of our 12th graders reported drinking and driving in the last 12 months. So that's a concern. That's a concern. They're out there on the road when we're out there on the road. If you look at riding with somebody who had been drinking, almost 30%, 29% of our youth reported riding with somebody who had been drinking. 16% of our 7th graders. You can see that peak at 11th graders at 40%, but still, a third of 12th graders, almost a third of 9th graders. A lot of kids are getting in the car with somebody who's been drinking.
Is that question riding with other students or riding with adults?
I was hoping somebody was asking me that question.
Parents?
No, it doesn't identify. So
That's
yes, it could be my parent was picking me up and I could tell he or she had been drinking. Yes, it could be with a parent. It could, and it can be with.
Okay, so the question in the survey didn't distinguish.
It didn't distinguish.
That's kind of a biggie. I mean, if
It is a
kids
biggie.
yeah. Sometimes the kids don't have a choice with the parents coming to pick them up.
Sometimes they don't have a
As
choice.
opposed to leaving a party with a 17-year-old driver who's been drinking.
In a couple of communities, we've done focus groups to get at this data a little bit more and ask some questions about, okay, so who is it you're driving with and why? And what we found in the communities that I'm familiar with that have done focus groups is that while there is this adult thing is happening, it is mostly other youth. And so then we ask, why? Why would you get in a car with somebody who's been drinking? And the answer was, well, I was supposed to be at Sue's house tonight, but we're actually over at, Joe's house drinking, and if I call my parents, then I have to tell them that I was lying to them about being at Sue's house tonight, so I'm going to take my risk with the driver instead of telling my parents I was lying to them.
But this would catch like the family functions things, where you're out to dinner, it's a birthday party, parent has 2 glasses of wine with dinner.
Yes.
Drives home. They're
Absolutely.
not drunk, it's
Yeah.
3 hours of food and
Yep,
hanging out.
yep,
But to a kid, you know, they're reported as someone who's been
Yep.
drinking.
yep,
It's a
absolutely.
little fuzzy.
And so that's why, you know, you can do things to follow up and get a little bit better sense of some of these data points, you know? What are we really talking about here? So yeah, I encourage that idea of focus groups to pick out some of that information. Again, you look at this by assets. So 3% reported drinking after driving, 10% in the 0 to 10 asset category, and again, much less. I was actually surprised to see even that 2% in the 31 to 40 asset category. I don't usually see that in communities where I do the data, where I look at their data, but again, very small percentages except for that 0 to 10 category. And if you look at the riding, again, look at the significant, and even just look at the significant assets between 0 to 10 and 11 to 20. I mean, from 73 down to 30%. It's such a tremendous drop in those kids. And you think that the assets are giving those kids from 11 to 20 on a much better sense of how to say, no, I'm not going to get in the car with you, or call somebody for help, or whatever it is that whatever strategies they're using. All we need is kids at 11 to 20, and the numbers go way, way down. So it's impressive. Okay, marijuana use. This is a big problem for us here in Connecticut right now. We've decriminalized it, and now we've medicalized it, right? This is medicine. Use marijuana once or more in the last 30 days. Again, that 30-day use measure. 8% of our youth report using marijuana in the last 30 days. From very few 7th to 8th graders up to almost 1 in 5 of our 12th graders last year report using marijuana in the last 30 days, so our current marijuana users. I was actually surprised that number is lower than I would have anticipated. Now, I've got another slide coming up a little bit later to kind of pull that out a little bit more. But again, if you look at it by asset categories, used marijuana, that 8%, 33% of those were 0 to 10 assets, down to 0 with 31 to 40 assets. And again, it drops by 2/3 just between 0 to 10 and 11 to 20 assets. So a lot fewer kids using these substances once you get past that 0 to 10 asset category. So what's the problem with marijuana, right? It's medicine now, right? Isn't marijuana safe, right? We've seen nationally, we've seen ads, right? It's the new beer, safer than beer. We've seen all these kinds of things coming across the pike at this point in time. You haven't probably seen some of those ads. Your kids have seen some of these ads. I'm telling you right now, your kids have seen some of these ads. So what's the problem, right? Okay, marijuana is addictive, right? We have to like get over this, right? Oh, you know, marijuana, right? I remember from the 70s and the 60s. Marijuana is addictive. And as a matter of fact, look at this. Children and teens who are in addiction treatment are 6 times likelier to be there for marijuana than all other illicit drugs combined. So I'm not talking about alcohol here, right? Let's put alcohol in a separate category for a minute. If we're there for illicit drug addiction treatment, so if we got 21 kids in East Granby, and we don't, but I'm just pulling numbers to make an example. We had 21 kids from East Granby in addiction treatment. 18 are there for marijuana addiction, and the other 3 are there for heroin or cocaine or Oxycontin, some of the prescription drugs, right? Anything else you can think of, anything else you want to name. The other 3 are there for all those other things combined. So it's serious, right? Go to the next slide. Thanks. 20% of crashes in the U.S. are caused by drug driving. 20%. And marijuana is the most prevalent illegal drug detected in these impaired driving fatalities. Research has found that adolescents who are regular heavy users of marijuana, I got one more thing to say about that last slide. I got to back myself up for a minute. So one of the things that we found is that in Colorado, between 2006 and 2010, when they increased access to their medical marijuana program, they found that crash fatalities related to marijuana, okay, so fatalities, we're talking about deaths here, doubled between 2006 and 2010. They found also that 74% of their kids, their youth, who were in addiction treatment for marijuana, reported getting their marijuana from medical marijuana card holders. So those who were legally allowed to have marijuana, and of course this is before Colorado just legalized it for recreational use. So these are some of the concerns that I have in Connecticut about marijuana, is that we now have over 1,200 medical marijuana card holders in Connecticut with no legal way to access marijuana, but they are accessing it right through the black market. And once they're able to legally access it next year, right, it won't be the beginning of next year, but sometime around the spring or early summer, we'll have these medical marijuana production facilities and dispensaries up and running. Access to marijuana will be greatly increased for all of us, including our youth. So that's enough. Now we'll go to the next one. Okay, so there's also some really good research now about marijuana negatively impacting adolescent brain development. Again, often in the area of memory, attention, decision-making, language, and executive functioning skills, some of these higher level skills. This is a nightmare for educators. Marijuana and alcohol, a nightmare for educators. Go to the next slide, which is going to give us a little bit more information on this. So again, we're talking about the hippocampus, right? Research showed that in a large group of regular marijuana users, their hippocampus was 12% smaller, right, with a control group of non-marijuana users. Last year, a New Zealand study came out that demonstrated over about a 20-year period, they followed youth who were using regular or heavy marijuana users in their teens. They followed them through to in their 30s, found an average of an 8-point IQ drop for those regular and heavy marijuana users. Now, I assume everybody knows, but just in case you don't, right, your IQ is your IQ, right? My IQ when I was 16 would be basically the same as my IQ now at 54. And when you start to see a drop, I mean, this could take somebody from average intelligence to below average intelligence. Okay. I haven't preached you out too much yet. You guys okay back there? Okay. Some other risk-taking behaviors that the Search Institute's Attitude and Behavior Survey measures. 18% of our youth report gambling behaviors. Again, from 6% of our 7th graders to over a quarter of our 12th graders. This is one of those areas that's getting more and more on our radar screen as we're understanding that gambling can be an addiction, just like a drug, just like a substance. People can crave the excitement of gambling as much as they can crave a hit of heroin or something like that. Eating disorder, 14% of our youth reporting having an eating disorder. And again, just kind of across the range there's not really much pattern to those numbers. 11% of our youth report attempting suicide. Up to almost 20% of our 11th graders last year, so our 12th graders this year. And 13% report being depressed. And again, quite a spread of numbers across, but we do see some increase. There's some pressure building for those high school students, obviously. We look at it again by the number of assets, and we see again, our youth with those higher asset levels are feeling much more confident, much more protected from some of these issues. 40% of those with 0 to 10 assets reporting those gambling behaviors. cuts in half when we go to 11 to 20 assets, down to 0 when we get to 31 to 40 assets. Eating disorders, 30% of those with 0 to 10 assets, down to just 6 when you get to 21 to 30 assets. Attempted suicide, 47% of those with 0 to 10 assets. And again, you're going to see in a few slides, it's a small number of our kids with that few assets. But there's a lot of them who are reporting attempted suicide, down to just 5% of 21 and 0 with 31 to 40 assets. And those with depression, again, 40% in that 0 to 10 asset category, 19%, less than half, just one asset category up, down to 0 again. So again, these data really demonstrate the power of assets here within the East Granby community. Those of our youth who have assets, who have more assets, are going to be making much better decisions and be in a much better place as far as protecting themselves against some of these things that they get hit with, Able to deal with stress better, able to deal with those situations that can get them down more, able to say no to drugs and alcohol and other substances a lot better. So I did do a couple of slides comparing us with national data. People usually like to see this. I suggest you take these slides with a grain of salt, right? In my opinion, it's much more important, that 45% of your 12th graders are using alcohol in the last month, that it's a little bit higher than the national average. I think that first number is really the important number that we need to focus on and say, that's way too many of our 12th graders. But as you can see, at 8th grade, slightly more than the national average, at 10th grade, below the national average, but then at 12th grade, back up higher than the national average for current use of alcohol. Cigarette use, we haven't talked about cigarettes much tonight. This slide, I think, is the graphic is so visual, it's just very helpful to see it like this. Look how far below we are the national averages and the numbers. I mean, we're at 2% for 8th grade, we're at 2% for 10th grade. All of a sudden, from 10th grade to 12th grade, we're up to almost 20%, and higher than the national average after being so far below the national averages at both the 8th and 10th grade level. With cigarette use in our community, something is really happening between that 10th and 12th grade, as far as our youth are concerned. And by the way, you don't have to go back, it's okay. MTF, I forgot to mention this, it's a national study called Monitoring the Future. Monitoring the Future is a national study that's been funded through the federal government back into the 80s. They have consistent data for decades at this point in time. It's one of 2 very well-regarded national surveys. And they give some great information. Actually, they gave information for 8th, 10th, and 12th grade across the nation, which is why I'm using these comparisons here. So here's past month marijuana use, current marijuana use. Again, you can see that in East Granby, our youth are using marijuana at rates below the national averages. I was, quite frankly, surprised to see this. In most communities in Connecticut, we are now above the national average, especially with the decriminalization and the medicalization of marijuana. We're seeing marijuana rates, use rates amongst our youth going up in Connecticut at this point. So these were pleasantly surprising to see these numbers for me. And then the assets challenge. Okay, you've got this same graphic in your handouts, the pamphlets that were in the back there. So 9% of our youth are in those 0 to 10 asset category. Okay, so it's about 1 in 10 of our youth, so it's a smaller number. We can be thankful for that. 38% of our youth are both in the 11 to 20 and the 21 to 30 asset category, and 15% of our youth are in that 31 to 40 asset category. So All in all, that wheel isn't a bad place to be starting. But obviously, our goal is to eliminate that 0 to 10 asset category in our community altogether. And how do we grow that 31 to 40 and that 21 to 30 asset categories as much as we can? And so I think that as we look at where we're going and what we need to do next as a community, I think those are the things that we really need to look at. Not only will we reduce youth substance abuse, but all those other risky behaviors that we're looking at as well. Questions? Okay, so enough data for now. As Sue said, there's plenty of data. This is just really a small sampling of all the data that's held within. And if you go online and you actually look at the data and you start looking at some of the question by question data, sometimes I find that just as fascinating as some of the big report stuff that they do. So at any rate, what can we do as a community? How do we come together? What do we do together? So the Search Institute has a number of recommendations, and this idea of a shared vision and a common purpose, right? We need to come to some agreement about what we want. What do we want to see in our youth as far as developmental assets, as far as youth substance abuse, as far as some of those other risky behaviors? There's a whole list of violent behavior kinds of categories in the survey that I didn't touch upon tonight. We just don't have time. But what are the important data that we really want to say, we've got to do something about this? We need to come together as a community and really create a common purpose together about how we're going to work together and what we're going to work on. And then that personal and collective involvement, right? Personal involvement, okay, I need to step in. I need to be part of this. I need to be part of the solution. I need to be part of making our community a healthier place, not only for our adults, but for our youth. And then we need to come together on it. So I need to step in, but if you don't all step in with me, I'm only going to accomplish so much on my own. Really can't accomplish a whole lot by myself. This is a public will, right? We need to have a common purpose and a will to move forward. And maybe we need to improve some policies. We need to look at what programs we have. Are they working? Aren't they working? What programs, we've got so much good data and information out there on what works and what doesn't. 30 years ago, we'd say, well, what kind of prevention programs do we want? Well, I got this idea. You got that idea. Let's try them out. Let's see if they work. We don't need to do that anymore. We know what works. There is great research out there about what helps kids, what builds assets, and what don't build assets. We know. We already know. We've got to get behind some of the things that we know that works. And so it's that social trust also, right? I may not be perfect. I may not do all the right things all the time. But my motivation is positive. I'm here for the right reasons. And when I make a mistake, I'm sorry. But can we work together? I'll trust that you're here to do the best you can do. You trust that I'm here to do the best that I can do. And again, if we're all perfect beings, right, we wouldn't be here in the first place, right? But we're all flawed beings. And so we'll just do the best we can. And I trust that you're here to do the best that you can. That relationship not only is so important amongst our adults, but those are some of the important messages we need to give to our youth too. So we need to engage adults, right? We need to activate different sectors of our community. I was talking about the business community earlier, okay? Right? We've got schools here represented. We've got town government here represented. These are important sectors of our community. How about the sectors that serve youth? Well, they're here too, right? But how about our civic organizations? Actually, I was hearing something about civic organizations being at the Halloween party last weekend, right? So we've got to get everybody involved. Where's our law enforcement? Where's our parents? We've got to get them all involved here. And of course, we've got to mobilize our young people. Our young people have to be involved in this, right? This isn't about, and this is get back to that community values youth. This isn't about what we're going to either do to or for our youth. It's what we're going to do with our youth. That's what it's about. So we may need to invigorate programs. We may need to change, mix things up, change things up, make them more effective. And we've got to influence civic decisions. What kind of decisions do we make as a community around this? And sometimes they may be public policy decisions. Sometimes they may be institutional policy decisions. But sometimes they may just be what's the norm of our communities? I got a great example of this for you. I work in a community where after doing a survey, and actually they also had a very negative incident. And sometimes negative incidents can be very motivating to the community. And we had a kind of a community event where parents talked to each other about their attitudes and perceptions about some of these issues. We had a lot of parents there who were parents of middle school students. And what they decided, and this was getting towards the end of the school year, what they decided as a result of this is that, you know what, this idea of calling the parents of the party where my kid is going when they're graduating from 8th grade, right? This is not such a bad idea, and maybe we could like come to a community decision that this would be a good thing to do. A parent was holding a graduation party for their kid, an 8th grade graduation party. What she found was, as a result of this event, every single parent except for I think one, so somewhere around 20-something parents, called her to ask if there was going to be alcohol or any substances or any, at the party. And many of them offered, well, is there anything I can do to help, right? And so all of a sudden it was like kind of this sea change of, this is okay, we could call, right? And I don't have to be afraid about whether you're going to be mad at me for, insinuating or being concerned about whether that might be something in your house. As a matter of fact, thank you for calling. I'm so glad to find out that you're concerned too, So what kind of civic decisions on all those kinds of levels do we influence? So realistically, practically, what could this look like? So, using some of this local data, right? Identifying the problems. What are the problems? What are the issues that we want to address that are most important within the community? Right? Let's plan. Let's make a plan. Let's figure out what we're going to do. Let's make a plan, right? Maybe a long-term plan for what assets we want to change or something like that. Short-term, what we're going to do, change, next month, 6 months from now, what are we going to do? What are we going to work on to make some changes here? And then prioritizing some of these developmental assets. One of the things that I often encourage communities, and I've said it here tonight a little bit already, what are the assets that are most important to you? What are the assets that when you look at, you latched onto that community values you, that was important to you. Well, as a community, what are these assets that we want to build as a community together? How do we engage our adults and our youth together to build those assets in a more targeted way, a more focused way, as a community with the ones that are important to us? We can do this. Right? Part of these plans is how do we engage as many members of the community as possible. And again, these different sectors of the community. This is really important because if I get 5 or 6 people working on this, that's good. But if they're all, from the schools or if they're all from town government, well, that's good, but it would be a lot better if we had people from all these other walks of life involved as well. That's what we need to do. We need to involve as many people as we can. How do we reach out and get them involved? And there's so many different ways that we can involve businesses. We can involve our civic organizations, right? Our houses of worship. So many different ways that we can get them involved in this. And there we go. Questions, comments, a lot of information. What concerns you? What makes you happy?
I think what makes me happy is seeing that the significant difference between 0 to 10 and 11 to 20. If you're able to push it, it's, you can say it's just 9% of our kids. Well, that's 9 out of 100.
Yeah.
So if you can push, that certainly looks like something that would be doable and also very valuable.
Yeah. Yeah. And those who are in some of these fields know that sometimes those 9 out of 100 kids, they take a lot of time to work with. They take a lot of our community time and resources to work with them. And if we can get to them before they get to some of these points here, right? we're going to have more resources for other things to work on as well. And they're going to be in a better shape to begin with. So, yeah.
I'm here tonight representing the schools. However, in my other life as a parent, I served on a community of concern in my town, which sounds like it stems directly from a survey like this. I'm not sure exactly what my town used. However, what we found when we met as a community with parents and schools and law enforcement and the stakeholders that you've mentioned, the biggest shift was when parents all came together and agreed on some common parameters. And along the lines of the anecdote you gave with the party, just saying because it's difficult in this day and age of technology when we know less about our children and our children's friends, to make that commitment. You know what? I am going to come out to the car, or you're going to come into the house when you pick, my child up. Those small things for every parent to do. You didn't have the child saying, "Ma, you're the only one." No, I'm not.
Yeah.
And it really made a big effect.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're getting at that issue of what we call social norms. And oftentimes, most times, kids and even adults, they really overestimate some of the normative behaviors that are actually happening here. If you ask youth how many kids are regular alcohol users, they're going to say a much higher number than that 21% that we were just looking at. Because, they see a few kids and they assume, well, more are,
And I do think it is difficult as parents, even as an educator.
Yeah.
I start to say, okay, am I the only one doing this? Because you start to kind of wonder about that. But this community of concern really brought together parents where you were confident in saying, no, I'm not, and it was okay.
Yes.
When many parents started doing it and their kids started to see it, it really became a non-issue for them.
Yeah. And unfortunately in that community, there was a high school party that same week, graduation party, that went horribly bad. I won't even get into the details, but it went horribly bad. And of course, what hit the news? The party where everything was great and all these parents were involved in doing the right thing, that didn't hit the news at all.
Yeah, as a school person, it didn't surprise me about the marijuana, having the alcohol much more than the marijuana, because that's what I've been dealing with for a number of years now. And breaking that to parents and sharing that information about the alcohol is quite sobering, maybe a good word to use, because it's always not my daughter, not my son. The whole issue of, gee, I thought I could trust that person, I thought they were home, and all that type of thing. That is right on, and I believe that the kids were very honest about the whole reflection about the alcohol, and I believe they were honest about the marijuana too. But I'm so glad to see that the alcohol, because I see that as one of the main issues that we have here in town.
I would think, in our town, the alcohol is way more accessible. I mean, we have a package store in town, but, with people with older brothers and siblings, or liquor cabinets, or at home, and coolers or whatever at parties. Whereas, like you were, saying the marijuana use being low, well, I would think it would be harder to come by something like that in such a small suburban area. But that's just my own thinking. I don't know how that.
Well, I think that's counterintuitive at this point in time. That's what it stays like.
At one point there was some graffiti being done on some of the signs and stuff coming in town from another town coming up, and I was told by my daughter what the graffiti meant, and apparently it was something to do with drug drops and marijuana places where kids were meeting and stuff. And I was shocked, hearing this from my whatever grade she was in at the time last year. So they have fixed some of the signs, but I guess now there's a market for stuff everywhere.
Yeah.
And if the kids can't get down to the city for it, maybe some of the city people are wandering. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's scary.
How do these substance abuse numbers compare to, say, 30 or 40 years ago? Has there been a drop or an increase, or has it been rather low?
Overall, drug use has dropped, and actually quite significantly from 30, 40 years ago. So when you look at marijuana use peaked amongst youth in the late 70s and has gone steadily downwards. There was a little uptick in the 90s, but then went down again. We are starting to see an uptick again now. But again, I think, and I don't quote me on this, but I think we're still way less than half of the, maybe even 2/3, but I'm not sure, but certainly less than half of the marijuana use rates of the late 70s.
And yet, I suppose that the levels of, say, prescription drug abuse like OxyContin and so forth are far higher than they were in those days.
Yeah, and again, some of those things weren't measured back then. This survey measured a lot, you know, the Monitoring the Future survey did measure a lot of things. But, you know, some of these things which are much newer, the idea of abusing prescription drugs, while has been with us all along, was not that big of a deal. And the numbers weren't rising. And again, the numbers overall are fairly small compared to alcohol and marijuana, but they're rising so rapidly across the country and have spurred other drug abuse problems. OxyContin, for example, has gotten so expensive, and heroin is so cheap and so pure that many, and again, adults, but we've been seeing it with youth now. In the last few years, we've been seeing it with youth as well, are giving up the OxyContin and going to heroin. And they're saying things like, well, I'm not going to be one of those drug users, so I'm going to snort it. But as they start to get addicted to it, they inevitably resort to, you know, injecting. So.
My question was similar. You showed a one-year snapshot over the time. How about the alcohol use? Is that stayed steady over the last, and are there local trends, U.S. versus localized, you know, Northeast, Southeast?
Yeah, and this is the first time the survey has been done here in East Granby, so we don't have any local trend data at all.
So one-year snapshot.
So it is that. In comparing to other communities in Connecticut, and again, I can give you what I would call more, you know, an anecdotal kind of perspective because I see data from a lot of other communities. One of the things, two things that surprised me on each side of the equation about your data was that your alcohol use was still higher than the national average. I was saying this to Sue beforehand. You know, 10 years ago, we used to, when I was with the Connecticut Coalition to Stop Underage Drinking, Connecticut youth rates from the late 90s into the early 2000s were about 26 to 28% higher than the national average. But we've seen some serious reduction in many Connecticut communities for underage drinking. So I was surprised to see your, especially that 12th grade number as high as it was. Not that there are other communities that still don't have higher rates. And I was also surprised on the flip side to see that your marijuana use rates were lower than I'm seeing in many other communities. So back to your point about access, which is a key point about use. How easy is it for me to get? I would guess that your statements about access are probably
Don't
true.
have a street corner in a seedy neighborhood or wherever.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's interesting, you made a comment before about trust. One of the things, some of this brain development research that we're finding about adolescents, right, is that prefrontal cortex, some of those, again, higher executive functioning skills, this is the last area of our brain to really get fully developed. And often, and especially in males, not until like the mid-20s or so is that area of the brain fully developed. And so when we talk about when we trust our kids, do I trust you not to use or not to use, or those kinds of things, one of the things you have to remember is that their brain, in that area of being able to make some of those decisions or make some, you know, it's not fully developed. Sometimes we're putting our kids in the position of being in a situation where their brain isn't really developed enough to really handle. And so it's not necessarily a matter of whether I trust you, my son or daughter, to use or not. It's, do I trust that I'm allowing you or putting you in situations where maybe they're gonna tax your brain capacity at this point in time because it's not fully developed. And so I think we need to take a different look at that whole trust issue, because it's not, given all things, I trust you completely, but given a kind of a difficult situation with a boy or a girl that you like and you want to look good with or anything like that, I mean, what might happen,
It's interesting you say that, because I find in working with youth that it's important for parents to be able to trust their children are going to make good decisions, but then it's also important to give them the tools to follow up with those decisions. So I tend to encourage parents to say, you can use me as the bad guy, right? You can say, my mother would kill me, my father, right, would lock me in the basement for the next 6 months if I did this. I absolutely cannot do this. I absolutely must call for a ride. I absolutely can't. Sometimes that is a tool.
Yeah.
As if when you're 16 and you feel like you
Yes.
are going to look like a fool, you need something to fall back on. And if
Yes.
that's what works, then that's a benefit.
I think that parental solidarity thing too is a good strategy where the middle
Yeah.
schoolers, but if like, the people would tell, oh, so-and-so has cool parents, and so, but if all the parents are equally uncool, then there's like no place for these kids to go.
It's a really good point.
Generational solidarity.
As a parent, is my primary job to be liked or to be a parent? And sometimes being a parent means that they're not going to like things I say. But let's not just put it all on parents sometimes, because how about our kids who are involved in sports? Let's get the coaches involved here. Coach catches me, I'm not playing the game on Saturday, or I'm not playing the game on Wednesday night, or whatever it is. And it's like, there's another one, And how do we get even further than that? Who else? Who are the other adults involved with these youth? Our youth ministers, right? Our school people, all of them. Let's get all of them involved on this.
Have you found in looking at the trends, you had it broken out by grade level, that following them, that the stats pretty much stayed the same? In other words, I'm thinking like if we, the 12th grade class, there were some concerns there. If we looked at the 10th grade class and we found that there were some issues and concerns, if targeting that or following that group, have there been any studies with the surveys?
Well,
Yeah.
Like if there's a spike in a particular grade level? or
Grade
something?
level, we follow that, or we made some curriculum.
there's a real, let me say the two sides to this. So what we find, generally speaking, is that obviously use is very low when you get down to the 6th or 7th grade level, and it just steadily increases through up to, through 12th grade. And so we see overall, those are trends that we see. We see those with some of these other kinds of behaviors that we've been talking about. But in any individual community, there's always these individual data that, kind of pop out at you that you are all much better at explaining than I am. I was surprised when I look at trends in other communities about the alcohol and marijuana data. You were not surprised at all. You're here, you know what's going on, you're seeing it,
And so schools and I'm high school, and I know.
Exactly, exactly. So do you see, for example, I was sitting in a community coalition meeting earlier, or actually last week. It was only Tuesday, last week. And they're talking about their 8th grade. This 8th grade class, there's issues in this class. It's one of those statistical anomalies, you can call it, but really, it's just a group of kids who feel, they can get away with anything, and they feed off of each other, and their use is higher than the 8th grade the last time they did the survey. And when they get to 10th grade, it'll likely be higher than the 10th grade before that, you know, so you do see that kind of stuff sometimes, you know. You probably know which grade, you know, you probably know which, you know, and some of you parents, you know what grades they are, where there's grades that have more difficulties, more problems. You see, you know, different kinds of violent issues going on, or what, you know, you see increased issues amongst some of those grades, you know. And so, there's
Or you know the students in working in a school system that have the 0 to 10 assets that we're trying to make those connections with.
my wife is a former elementary school educator, and you could see it you could see it in 2nd grade. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
As I looked at and listened to all of the information, I couldn't help but think about where do we begin and what are the things that we need to teach students from a very early age. You know, something as simple as letting your child get used to hearing the word no. Setting very clear boundaries. Setting examples for children. You know, giving them opportunities to make good decisions and to use their good judgment, starting at a very early age. All of the things that are possible for us to do that helps them with their decision making.
Yes.
And helps them to develop the fortitude and the strength and to be able to say no to their friends and to resist some of those behaviors that they know are harmful.
That's right.
I find that it's perhaps the hardest thing for any teenager to do is to say no, to take a stand and to stand up to their peers and you know, really use good judgment. And so anything that we can do as a community to help our students to make good decisions and to use good judgment, I think will take us and, you know, and really help to make a difference, you know, take our students to the point where they're much, much stronger as they get older.
You know, like, what do you put in your mouth, you know? If you don't know what it is, don't put it in your mouth. I mean, we could teach our 5-year-old this, right? We could teach our 7-year-old this. You don't know what it is, don't stick it in your mouth. Don't just take something that somebody says, here, this is whatever, you know. Well, what is it? You know, I want to know what it is before I eat it, you know. And again, you know, good with food, but then with anything else, let's question. Let's, you know, part of that critical thinking skills of decision making that you're talking about.
Well, I think one of the big differences nowadays, as opposed to 30 or 40 years ago, is we do have all this brain science that clearly indicates that you're going to be shaving off IQ points, that, you know, that the functionality of the brain later on is going to be impaired, you know, long before the buzz wears off. So I think it would behoove us to kind of make that an angle instead of concentrating on the illegal aspects of it, because that's probably just going to goad people to do it. Rather, you know, in their self-interest, do you want to be stupid? Do you want, you know, do you want to, you know?
Absolutely.
Do you want to have a brain that doesn't work well, you know? That sort of thing, as opposed to just concentrating on the forbidden fruit aspects of these things. I think that's deleterious in terms of trying to get people to use.
I agree. And also, you know, the fact that these industries have been targeting our kids for decades. I mean, let's face it, you know, I mean, we've got quotes from the tobacco industry from 30, 40 years ago, you know, the youth are our market, you know, if we're not going to be marketing to youth, we're going to be out of business in 5 years, you know, all this kind of stuff. Same thing with the alcohol industry. I mean, you know that somewhere around 80-something% of all the alcohol is consumed by about 18 and not exactly, somewhere around 18% of the population. Those are heavy drinkers, right? And of those 18% that's drinking 80-something% of the alcohol in our country, all of them, almost all of them, 90-something% of them started with an alcohol problem in their teenage years. So if I'm the, if I'm the CEO of InBev, right, the parent company of Anheuser-Busch, and I want a bigger Christmas bonus next year, I gotta get some of your kids addicted to my beer before they turn 18 or 20. It's just the bottom line.
But even under those circumstances, those people with the lower assets, the 0 to 10s, that they might be drinking because they have those few assets, rather than being the cause of them having those few assets.
That's true.
Right.
That's true. From a marketing perspective, it's gonna be much easier to go after those kids than kids with 31, 40 assets, absolutely. Yep.
Just of the herd.
Yeah. I know, they're our kids.
John, I think it's important for the community to recognize that East Granby does have a youth service bureau. They're also the designated local prevention council. So their mission really is to work on specifically engaging the community in a strategic plan to address prevention activities. And having been through the survey twice in Granby, we created a much larger coalition, Prevention Council. And I have to say, the sectors are all represented and we all work great together, but we can't get a parent to show up at a workshop. It's rare. And quite honestly, we've had very little impact on changing policy or norm because of the lack of parent participation. So I really encourage the community, you as representatives here, to encourage parents to reach out, to contact the Youth Service Bureau, to find out how they can get involved on the Prevention Council, because really the parents are one of the key sectors. And I think going back to Dr. Mahoney's point of how do we create that good decision-making skills, and we need parents to reinforce that, as well as the schools and the police and youth services and clergy. It's really important to get parents at activities. It's really important for the Prevention Council to maintain their energy too, to have parents come. And I think we need to get the word out there, and again, maybe we'll try to contact more parents and make sure they get onto the website and read the survey and get that information.
It's shocking what a small amount of parents, I mean, you guys are all here because you're on a board or you're connected with the schools. We've got three
Also
parents. Yeah, three parents sitting here, and as I said, I had heard about this from Talk Turkey, September edition, never saw anything about it in Granby News afterwards. Didn't get anything sent through the email system at the high school for this. I know you guys have contacted us to come to other meetings, for financial budget issues. I did not get an email, I looked today, did not get an email from, it might have been on the Ed line, but there was not a direct email sent from the high school to me as a parent. So I was just this morning, I've been looking for this has been on my calendar. So, I think communication, we're such a small community, I think sometimes we take that for granted, that people will hear about it through the grapevine maybe. I mean, I know things don't get stuffed in backpacks anymore to come home to the parents.
One of the things that I just want to kind of emphasize the point that Carrie was making is that as the local prevention council, the East Granby Youth Services, part of a network that includes all 169 Connecticut communities. And there's there is some hierarchy to the system, but the point is that there's quite a prevention network, quite a prevention infrastructure here in Connecticut. And so the resources that East Granby Youth Services can pull in are, can be significant. Informational resources, help and support from different organizations that support all the local prevention councils. So there is a real network which you can access information, what's working in other communities, all kinds of great stuff that you can get through this network. And so you don't have to feel like you're out here, on your own. You can find out what's going on in almost any community by asking the right people in Connecticut, So.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your comments, for your participation. We really see this as the beginning of a conversation. It gives us a baseline. It tells us where we are today. As part of the Youth Services Bureau, I look forward to working with all of you, with all of the components of our community that we can pull together to take this data and turn it into programs and policies that really can improve the number of assets that our youth enjoy. So we appreciate your time and your support. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.